Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. I am Abe with MysticGenMara.com, a small town mystic from the middle of Idaho. And tonight we are going to continue our Occult and Crochet series. The person we're going to talk about is Gerald Cardell, and he's an interesting character. And I have little, not really update on my shawl that I've been working on. Due to some things going on this last couple of weeks, I have been busy as heck at day job, so not much has been done, but this is where we're at right now. We've got started on the last color of this one, so hopefully, if life's not too hectic, I'll be able to get that finished before the next episode. And I don't know about anyone else, but it has been absolutely beautiful outside the last few days, so it's been kind of nice to be able to do some of my research sitting out on my patio where I've got all sorts of tomatoes and flowers and peppers started, so it's fun to be outside where it's springtime and everything's coming alive. You can really feel the magic in the air. So I also, before I get too far into this, want to give a huge shout out and thank you to everyone who's been subscribing and for all the likes, and you can comment a little bit more, that's cool, but I do want to say I appreciate everything because it's slow growth, but it's still growth, and I do want to say thank you to everyone for that. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and drop a like on the video if you enjoy this type of content. And comment, let me know if you're hopping in live on the chat, live stream, go ahead and chat away. The Occult and Crochet series, is to show off some of the different things that I'm doing in the crochet world, because I love to crochet. I just don't have as much time as I'd like to at the moment for that, which is a little frustrating. But the occult part of it is going through different key members of the occult or spiritual community, including some religious figures, kind of giving us an idea of the person, not so much of the movement that they worked on. So when you look back at some of the other ones, Gerald Gardner and Alex Sanders, we talk a little bit about their magic and about their rituals, but it's more about the person behind it, and that's what I'm trying to shoot for. And I'm not going into humongous deep dives, full biographies by any stretch. I'm trying to keep them around an hour-ish. So it's enough to give you an idea of the person and find out if it's someone you're interested in. If you are, I also provide links in the description. Sometimes it's to an official website, sometimes it's to a group. There's been a few of them, like the official Golden Dawn and some of those, that I'll just link. If you're interested in further discovery, here you go, because that's not what I'm here for. I want to introduce you to these people, not teach you all of their things. I want you to understand the people as people, because there's a lot of things that are said about some of these historical figures that is completely wrong, and it's based out of fear or just lack of knowledge. So that's kind of what I'm working on with this, is just trying to get people a little more information so they can make an informed decision. And I've been kind of focusing on Wicca the last couple of months, mainly because it's been something that I'm really feeling led to bring forward. I have a couple more people that I might talk about. I haven't quite decided yet on those, and then we'll kind of do some shifting over to why the concept of witchcraft kind of got buried into the myths and the darkness, because there's a few people from back in the day that weren't so great. So that's kind of where I'm going to try to head this over the next month or so. I can't give an exact date because it also depends on how things turn out with the people that I'm going over next. So, for now, we're going to go with Gerald Cardell. He is kind of a lesser-known Wiccan founder or Wiccan leader. I've read about him a few different places, and it's usually just in a passing. We'll get into how he became a little bit more infamous here shortly, but for now, that's where we'll leave him. He was involved in the witchcraft movement, and he ran parallel to Gerald Gardner for a while, but he is not, according to anything that I could find, he's not a Gardenian witch. He wasn't initiated by Gardner. There is, I should say, some suspicion that he was initiated by Gardner himself, but there's not anything to prove that outright. So we're going to leave that into the lore of we don't know if he was Gardenian or not. So let's wander down the path into our, not the way back machine, but a way back for now. Charles Cardell. He was born in 1895, so, a couple days ago. He was born with the surname of Maynard. This one is a little bit weird to me, is like, where did you come up with Cardell? And as we go through this, I'll point out when it changes, but yeah, it's interesting. Why is my mouse moving? He was born in East Sussex in Britain, another Brit that we're talking about here. In Charles's younger day, he would join the British Army. He was about 18, 19, I believe, is when he joined. He would serve in India primarily while serving there, and he would achieve the rank of major. And during this particular time frame, there wasn't a lot that I am not a huge World War history buff, like the big wars. I'm not really my thing. But to go from joining to major, there had to have been something going on that set him aside to get him to move up, or, and this happens at times, his family was well-to-do and he was given an honorary position. I don't know the exact stance there. I couldn't find exactly any of that information, so we'll just leave it at he achieved the rank of major. After Charles' military career, he would become a stage illusionist or stage magician. I personally will call stage magicians illusionists, mainly because the concept of a magician or a magic user has an entirely different meaning to those of us that study the actual occult. And if you've ever watched Clive Barker's old movie, The Lord of Illusions, one of the characters in there refuses to use the term magician because he sees it a lot like how I kind of see it. If you're using actual magic versus illusionary stuff, it's a different thing altogether, so keeping the two apart. He started off doing stage illusion stuff. He would use the stage name of Cardell when he was doing his shows, which is a kind of an odd stage name, but and there is a theory, or at least a reference to, maybe I should say is a better term, his father or his family were stage magicians as well, and that's kind of what got him started in his journey there. But that doesn't quite add up with how he ended up in the military to the rank he did, and it doesn't make sense to things that occurred later on. I'm not saying they weren't involved in it, but it's like, it was one little blip that I found on one website that references his father or his family being involved in illusionary stage magician type stuff. So, take what you want out of that. But this is not the only thing that Charles was involved in. The stage magician, stage illusionist was more of an evening job type of a thing. His primary interest after the military service was psychology, and he actually worked as a psychologist dealing with people who have had negative or horrific, bad, etc. occult experiences, so survivors of that kind of stuff, which is a hugely supportive, in my mind, thing to do. But according to how things play out, I wonder what his real intentions were by doing this. We'll get into that. And this would be his primary source of income through the 1950s and 60s. Generally, it is assumed after the 1960s, after everything happens here, he kind of went on the government dime because he didn't have anything at that point. So, it was in the early 1950s that Charles would change his last name to Cardell. What's interesting about this, I dug around trying to find any reference as to why he would change it, and he may have mentioned it in some of his books, which I have not read. Full disclosure, I do apologize. But there's not anything online that I could find about why he changed his name, but his name was changed to Cardell. And it was also around this time that he would... oops, I have things in completely wrong order. That's not good. So, we're going to... Just one second. Sorry. You know, live streams. That's what they're for, is to see how people act in real life. And I try to find humor in my ding-dong movements, and this is one of those ones where it's like, why? I meant to move the section earlier. Sorry, I'm just babbling now. But it was in the early 1950s that he would change his last name to Cardell. It was also around the same time he would acquire a substantially large estate, which is, according to what I was digging up, it's 2 different properties. One was Dumbledine, and the other one is Dumblecott. And if you're from Britain, I apologize for how I'm probably murdering those names. And these properties were actually in Charlwood, Surrey. If you know Harry Potter, you at least know where Surrey kind of is. And it was also at this time, and this is another one of those head scratchers. Charles would meet a woman named Mary Edwards, and they would excuse me, they would live on their estate land together. They kind of owned it jointly. And Mary Edwards, at the time she would move into Dumbledine and Dumblecott, would change her name from Mary Edwards to Mary Cardell. Again, why? She was approximately 15 years his junior, which is also strange. It was said that they claimed to be siblings. And it's not just 1 or 2 people have saying that. That's how they presented themselves. Oh, hi, my name's Charles, this is Mary, my sister. Little bit interesting there. This was Mary. This is a picture from around the mid-60s. And this one is... where'd it go? This is Charles. Not one of his better pictures, but this was taken around the same time, each of these pictures. They are... I'm not sure how you would put them as siblings with that much of an age gap, but whatever. And the pair would actually run a magic shop on the land that sold potions and charms. There's a little bit I can say about that, and we'll go into it here in a second. But we're going to go over the estate. Sorry. The estate is interesting, and I couldn't find really good pictures of it, but the home that they had on the land, because apparently there was like 2 homes, but they only lived in one of them. The other one was kind of like a extra guest house type thing. They decorated it with various magical symbols. Okay, can't argue with that. I like this. I like where we're going here. There was an ankh. There were antlers above all the doors, which is a protection thing. There were 7 pointed stars randomly around the house, and in one room in particular, and I could not find the purpose of the room, if it was his library, if it was an altar room, if it was a temple room, the bedroom, but there was one room in particular that had a 7-pointed star on the ceiling. Okay, I'm good with this so far. And Charles also had a deep and abiding obsession, from what I was reading, with this letter here. And he had the capital letter D in several places around his house. There were sets of 7 of them in a circle, and I couldn't find an image of it. Trying to make one, it was not turning out well. So you'll have to visualize this letter in 7 of them in a circle. But he had these several places around his property, and I had to go digging because I couldn't quite figure out why the letter D was so important to this man, because especially 7 of them, it was a little bit strange to me. And I found that he had a belief that 7 Ds summed up the magical philosophy of how to live life. Okay, so we're going to go into that real quick. And the 7 Ds are as follows, and I found the information from a specific website from the UK. I did put it in the description because, again, they have a lot of other information on there. She or he, I can't remember the name now, they are working on and published a book that's kind of a history of the 1950s and 60s Wicca, and there's a prominent section in this book of Charles Cardell and Mary Cardell, and so I put that in the description as well. You can check that out if you are interested about more of what goes on during this time, because there's a lot that happens in the 50s and 60s in Britain around this bubble. Anyway, the 7 Ds stand for Delon or Dalon, representing the moon and humility; Donna, representing Saturn and respect; Dello, representing Jupiter and trust; Dovin, representing Venus and kindness; Dessa, representing Mercury and truth; Doran, representing Mars and honor; Deth, D-E-T-H, representing the sun and dignity. So you're looking at humility, respect, trust, kindness, truth, honor, and dignity. So these are pretty good basic concepts of how to live life, and it's an interesting way to remind yourself of what each of the planets represents to a certain extent as well, and how that can factor into your life. And with that, this is where some of our controversies begin. There's a theory that has some ground. There's some people that actually are putting 2 and 2 together here, and they're like, wait a minute. 5 of the 7 Ds that Charles liked to use were actually from Gerald Gardner's work. And considering when he really started getting into this focus, Charles and Gerald were being friendly with each other. They weren't, like I said, I couldn't find an exact thing if Charles had actually been initiated or not, but they were willing to exchange information because Charles had a claim that he was from a long lineage line of witches as well, but he had a different term for it. And we'll get into all that. I just want to kind of go through the property real quick. There's one more thing about the property. The magic shop that they both operated was called Dumblecot Magic Productions. When I first read that, I had to laugh because I kept thinking of a movie studio, something productions, but it was not the case. One of the products, though, and I'm kind of curious about this product, honestly, was claimed to be an ancient magical formula for beauty. It's like an ointment or a cream, with a special rune included to enhance personal attractiveness. Honestly, I'm curious about the formula because there were formulas back in the day that had some really wild stuff in them. And just to see how ancient the recipe really is, depending on the wording of it. And what kind of a rune did you guys add to the mix? Like, what kind of a rune was included? Yeah. GT Synergy Kombucha, not affiliated or sponsored, but awesome kombucha if you like kombucha. Charles had met and become friends with Gerald Gardner around that early 1950s period, and that was also around the same time that he changed his last name, which was that inspired by Gardner, because Gardner, in his tradition, you take a witch name, or was it just Cardell, Charles being Charles, who knows. He was also, during this time period, on really good terms with Gardner's coven. It wasn't just Gerald, it was actually the coven as well, the Bricketwood coven. This would not last, though, because the outspoken occult leader of Gerald Gardner would have a falling out with Charles, and Gardner just had this thing about rubbing people the wrong way because he was trying to be very out loud with how he was explaining, showing, revealing what Wicca was at its core. My mouse is being goofy the last few days, so I apologize. I'm going to have to do this a little bit slower. One of the things that happened during this falling out was with Gardner, but also in a roundabout way included Doreen Valiente, who we talked about earlier. Charles would publish an article in 1958 in which he would offer an invitation to all, and this is his words, genuine practitioners of the craft to get in touch with him. And personally, I feel like he was quietly trying to build a community, unlike Gardner, who was out there jumping up and down really loudly about it. I mean, not literally. Not that I know of literally, but he was being much more vocal about it. And I feel like this was Charles' way of trying to build a community without making it so public. Just my opinion. Either way, he sent out these feelers with this article. And Doreen Valiente responded. And when he wrote this letter, Doreen and Gardner were not super close. They were kind of having one of their off-again periods. And Doreen would arrive to visit Charles and his friend Mary. And it was during this instant or the next one. There's two little instances with Doreen that soured this friendship. But this first time he showed her, Charles showed Doreen some of the items that were, in his words, authentic witch items. One was a witch bracelet, there was another that was a sacred athame, and Doreen believed that these were very similar to Gardner's relics, which would also imply that he had a genuine lineage going here. And he noted that this couple was worth paying attention to because they had aspects of the true religion. So Doreen, at this time in 1958, the first kind of introduction to them, was very much on board that these guys might be genuine followers of the ancient path, only a different line. But Charles did not have the greatest of luck in certain areas of life, we'll just say that. Later, Doreen would meet with Charles again while he was in London, and when Charles was in London, it was generally for work. Remember, he was a psychologist. But he also had a kind of a curio room, or maybe even a small ritual room there that he kept in London as well. And this is where Doreen would meet with him again, and they would have a disagreement, over the origins of some items that Charles had collected. Charles claimed they were authentic from centuries ago. One was from Pompeii, one was, I can't remember what the other one was from, but they were both from several hundred, if not thousands of years previous, and they were given to him through his spiritual lineage, and that's fine, I'm not, whatever. But Doreen would look at them, and Doreen had a little bit of history with knowledge and training, so when she would look at these items, she's like, those aren't that old, and they're not from that time period, they're literally from like 50 years ago. One of them in particular, she pretty much called him out for that was a 19th century thing, not a BC from Pompeii thing. And this really soured their friendship between Doreen and Charles, and it started a downward spiral that eventually would have Charles not being the friendliest towards Doreen or for Gardner. As I said before, Charles felt that the craft of the wise was best kept more quiet, more low-key, not so bombastic and loud or public. But he would write several articles over the years about the occult and witchcraft, and nothing blatant like he was involved, just kind of informative little things, nothing too expose, except for this one. And this is the first one that he really went public with and kind of a little loud about. He would eventually write and publish a small booklet called Witch, under the pen name of Rex, and I've tried to say this name, so just one second, Rex Nemorensis, in or around 1964 or 65. There's two different dates that I found, so that window of time. The name sounded vaguely familiar, and as I was looking up the name of the book to see if it's still in print, it is. link in the description. I ended up finding out that as I was Googling and kind of, searching up this book, that the name Rex Nemorensis was actually a legendary priest to the goddess Diana. So, we're going to take a little side journey here and hop back a couple of centuries. Rex Nemorensis lived in Aricia, Italy. And if I'm saying that wrong, I apologize. That's how it sounded when I was listening to it. This is on the shores of Lake Nemi. The aspect of the goddess Diana was Diana the Nemorensis. So, Rex Nemorensis. The priest was known as the king of the sacred grove that existed on the shores of the lake, where he would take offerings and etc. to the goddess Diana. The lore says that the priest was king of the grove as long as he could hold the position in open combat against a certain type of person. Not anyone could go fight the king of the grove. Only one kind could. And no one ever, with the risk of death, was allowed to cut or snap off a piece of any branch within the grove. There was an exception to this, and this is the same type of person who could fight the king of the grove. A runaway slave, very specific wording here, it had to be a runaway slave, could snap off a twig from the golden sacred tree, which apparently there was a tree in the middle that had some different look to it. And when that branch was snapped, that was declaring combat against the current king. But it could only be done by a runaway slave. Not a free man, not a free woman. It had to be a runaway slave. And once the branch was shown, runaway slave, I have branch, then they would fight in a mortal combat battle until only one survived. Little Highlander going on there. And this is how a king would be replaced. He would remain king as long as he could hold his own against runaway slaves, and before anyone gets their dander up. Slaves in this time, more often than not always, but more often than not, would be debt slaves. Like, you got into way too much debt, someone bailed you out, you couldn't pay it back, so guess what? Now you're working at my house. Had nothing to do with race. That's not what we're talking about here. There were a lot of different slaves. Sometimes it was from war campaigns, but the language doesn't describe a race. When I was looking this up, it specifically just said a runaway slave. So anyone, I don't care if you're purple or blue, if you were a runaway slave, you could fight for the king of the grove. But that was just something that kind of made me giggle, was like the wording, very, very specific. It had to be runaway slave. This legend and position crossed over from Greece to Greece as well. So from kind of a Roman standpoint with Diana to Greece is from what I was finding. The goddess in that situation was Artemis. Really, the combat, the grove, all of that was almost identical. It was just the name of the goddess was different. But if you look at the energies of the different goddesses that I mentioned, Diana and Artemis, they're not that different energetically. Why is my phone going off? I mute the stupid thing and it starts going off like, hey, let me know I'm here. I don't want to know you're here. Leave me alone. Okay. Either way, the position was the king of the grove was a dangerous position to hold at best. Yeah, you would be taken very well care of as the king or priest of the grove. Food was taken care of, shelter was taken care of, but you were always armed. Your sword was always at the ready. You were always on the alert for the next threat, because if a slave ran away, they knew that if they could beat the current king, then they wouldn't have to worry about going back to whatever situation they were running away from. In a way, this was seen as a human sacrifice ritual, and honestly, if you really break it down and kind of go over what was going on there, it really was. Diana would only accept a man or a priest if he was strong and powerful. Diana didn't like men, so if you're going to be in her court, so to speak. You had to be the strongest of the strong and the most powerful person there, otherwise she probably wasn't going to be too friendly towards you. In my personal opinion, as a priest in Wicca, this is a good choice for Charles to use as his pen name. Rex, as a priest, was strong and devoted to the goddess. And what a great way to bring Wicca and the Lord and Lady to the public through a gentle, or more of a gentle way, more of just kind of like sliding it in. But Charles, under his name of Rex, would call out and even go so far as to blatantly insult Gerald Gardner, and by extension, he tossed Doreen Valiente under the bus as well. He would go on to share some of Gerald Gardner's Book of Shadows, rituals, and some spells that he copied when they were still being friendly into this book. So it's like, we're going to introduce you to what we've got going on, but I'm going to make some really rude pokes at these other guys. And I only read some excerpts, so I don't know the full extent of the insults. Like I said, I haven't read his work. He just keeps popping up in things that I'm reading. So, we're here to discuss them. There's another theory as to how he got the information for his book, and that is he received parts of this Book of Shadows, from a friend that he had introduced to Gerald Gardner years before, and now she was feeding him information that she was collecting from Gerald's work. Either way, Gerald's work ended up in Charles' pamphlet. This was all going on. All of this side chaos with Charles and Gardner and Doreen and all of that, while Charles was trying to get his own coven, the Coven of Atho, off the ground. Of course, he used the term Athor. And it was from Charles that it was assumed we started using the term Wicca. He believed that the witchcraft tradition was an older tradition than what was previously thought, and at one point held the name of Wixen, what we would call today Wicca. And Wixen is Wiccen, and over time they just took the N off. And this was it. I am really not doing good with my editing right now. I am sorry about that. His tradition doesn't get a lot of traction under Charles. He kind of brought it forward, and we're just going to kind of take the notes here and go with it. He brought it into existence under him, but his rituals were they weren't the cleanest as they could have been. It was based off of the worship of Athor, or Atho. There was aspects of Crowleyism that would pop up in a couple of his things. There was a heavy leaning on Gerald Gardner's work, which, again, made people suspicious as to where did you get your information from. But it was during all of this that when he was building his own coven, he would bring in a friend of his to do some work around the property. The friend would get curious, and this friend's name was Raymond Howard. And so he would eventually be initiated into Charles's group, but he would leave Charles's group, not on friendly terms, and form a group of his own, which would actually take what Charles had started and develop it into a full-blown, a little bit more structured coven of Atho. And I don't know if it's a direct line or not, because I couldn't find an exact pathway for it, but it sounds like the Coven of Atho in a form is still alive and well today. So what Raymond Howard did was actually kind of refine it and actually present it and bring it into a more usable state. And I might go over Raymond a little bit later. I was poking around to kind of include him maybe. There's a little bit there, but there's also some vagueness and a little bit of controversy that goes on there, which I feel like anything touching Charles would end up in controversy, and not the good kind like it did for Gerald or some of the other ones. So, Raymond, at one point, after kind of leaving Charles's group, would deem it necessary to take Charles to court over a package that had been sent to him. To be fair, what was in the package was most definitely on the magic side of things, and Raymond would say that he received this from Charles. There wasn't a return address, obviously, but included in the box was an effigy, which is a symbolic representation of a person, in this case Raymond, and it had been pierced through with a needle, which sounds kind of like a voodoo situation to me, but you know, they could do themselves. There was also something else in the package that to me didn't make a lot of sense, but I also don't know the exact reasoning for it. But in their package with the stabbed effigy, there was a mirror. So I'm not sure what that meant, like reflect it back to you, but it was just kind of in the box. But because of that, Raymond assumed it was Charles and took Charles to court. And in this particular situation, Charles won. To me, this case would have been a little bit hard to prove and prosecute, mainly because magic, even today, is not officially recognized as a genuine practice. A lot of people, especially when you get into this kind of the world, the legal system, they look at it as it's cute meditation. It might be a good spiritual practice. Does it really do anything? We can't measure it. We can't weigh it. Therefore, the court doesn't acknowledge it. So that was kind of the reason that Charles didn't lose this one. He actually won this one. There were some laws around witchcraft at the time, but for many years those had been really hard to prosecute in the more reasonable, educated age. And it was in this time period a lot of them would actually be taken off the books. So it wasn't like this was a big thing. Like, oh, witchcraft rules, you know. Just, it wasn't a big deal. Now, this time period would be classified from, you know, about 63,234 through about 72,34. So about a 10-year window here. There is a kind of insult name for this time period, and unfortunately, from what I keep finding, this is kind of where I heard of Charles in the first place, they called it the Modern Witch Wars, because this is where the covens were kind of like vying for who has the best religion and who has the best background, and Charles kind of ended up in the middle of all this, because you had Alexander's who was developing his covens, and they were growing rapidly at this time. Gardner had passed away around this time period, and so you still had the Gardenian line that was growing, and they weren't at odds with Alex and his group, but they definitely were growing apart, which that's fine, but they weren't hating each other. But then you have someone like Charles coming up and bouncing around and carrying on and stirring up conflict, and there were a few other players in the game at that point, so there was a lot of growing pains for the new concept of Wicca or witchcraft in the modern era, and this bubble of time was very hostile at points. Like I said, a lot of this, I think, if we really wanted to break it down, goes back to people like Charles, if not Charles himself, stirring this pot. And that's, like I said, if you check out the author who wrote the other book linked that I got some of the information from, I think they are going to go into a bigger detail of it, because I was reading some of the excerpts from the book, and it sounds like they are very much focused on explaining or trying to unravel what was going on here. So again, I'm personally going to pick up the book because I want to get a little more information about all this mess that was going on here. There was a lot more drama that was going on at this time as well. There is a reporter who also received a package, but this reporter received a package after this reporter did something they probably shouldn't have done. So there was legal things popping off all over the place. Raymond was going after Charles. Charles actually was winning that case, but then a report came out from a reporter they claimed to have seen Mary and Charles doing this very borderline evil ritual with a tree with 5 limbs, and there were a shrunken head on an altar, and crystal balls and swords and all this other stuff. And Mary and Charles decided to bring a case against the newspaper who published this article, claiming libel. Basically, this person was making up stories and lying about what was seen. And while they were doing this, Charles, not wanting to be anything like Gerald Gardner, would go out to invite in reporters to an actual ceremony, a real one, to prove that there was nothing bad going on. What? Okay. One reporter would actually take up the offer. That reporter's name was W.J. Locke, writing for the County Post, and he would show up, take some pictures, watch a very simple ritual, nothing elaborate, and he wrote a rather basic report of the ritual, which is fine. The other reporter, on the other hand, the one who snuck in and watched it, he, after the court case that we're about to go into, he received a gift as well. And this particular package had a wooden fish that had its tail broken off, and the tail was in the box as well. And there was a note that implied that the reporter was not a real reporter. I'm not exactly sure what that symbology was, if it was broken fish as in you weren't really doing anything important, or if it was trying to break off his ability to move freely. There's a lot about the stuff that was going on at this time that made no sense, at least from an outside perspective. So, the case where the reporter gets the fish is actually the case of libel that was filed against the first paper. This particular case, due to lawyers, I will just call them that, and Charles and Mary's eccentricities, I guess we'll say, went on for years. I believe it was 4 years off and on in court that this situation was happening, but it did not end in Charles and Mary's favor. After showing that they were trying to expose Gerald Gardner and his people with what they were doing, the store, and inviting these genuine, authentic witches to meet up with them, that's what they were trying to say their business was for, was to be a front to gain followers, then use these followers to watch and examine Gerald's groups, maybe even infiltrate the group and get his writings and see how they were damaging young minds and how they should be stopped, because, Charles was a great psychologist that was trying to understand and protect people from the occult. Doreen Valiente would actually go to these trials, especially the last few of them, and she was kind of shocked by the blatant dishonesty that was being shown by Charles specifically, to the point where when they lost, she actually felt almost vindicated for what he'd been doing. She didn't really wish him ill so much as, this is what happens when you play with the dark side, type of thing. The courts of that day would not see anything magic or paranormal in the actions that were being done during this time, not really seeing that Gerald's work was doing anything wrong, and they also didn't see what the reporter did as a negative. So this is where Charles and Mary's would lose this particular case. During the time that this particular court proceeding was happening, though, the several-year period, and I found this little tidbit of information amusing, but also what are you doing, dude? Charles, during the trial itself, the ongoing lengthy trial, was out there talking smack on the lawyers representing the other newspaper. What are you doing? You don't talk publicly about an ongoing legal proceeding, especially not ripping on the prosecutors or the other side's lawyers. And that's exactly what he was doing. The newspaper, once the first case was over, the newspaper's lawyers, the lawyers, not the paper itself at this point, would go on to sue Charles for basically defamation, and it wasn't hard to prove. He was very vocal about it. And in 1968, they would win the case against Charles. Well, the second case, the second loss of several during this time period, this was the last straw for Charles, basically. This left Charles and Mary, for all intents and purposes, completely bankrupt. They had nothing but land. They were done. And in one sense, you know, like a lot of these people, you're ending up with nothing. But in this particular instance, Charles, Mary, you did this to yourself, guys. I have no defense of this. And the other part is, even from today's standpoint, be careful. If you decide to sue somebody, you're playing this game, be careful with that. Because a lot of bad things can happen because the legal systems are weird. But the other part is, if you're in a court proceeding, there's this little thing called keep your mouth shut. Just shut up. Don't say anything until the judge says case dismissed or case closed or whatever he whacks his little gavel and says. You don't say anything at all. Like, just shut up. There's some people today on the internet that need to learn that. But Charles couldn't seem to do that. And so during this 4 years of this first court battle, he kept talking all this garbage. And once that battle was over, the lawyers went after him. Like, what are you doing? Stop. Yeah. As I was going through that, I was like, I would love to have, and I might still go over this later, just kind of toss it in as an extra video or something, not a live stream. But I'm kind of curious as to what the exact court records state and how much information is actually in them, just for the simple fact of, what did you do to piss off these lawyers to that extent? I mean, that's fascinating to me. Anyway, back to the story. Charles and Mary, because they had nothing at this point, would end up selling some of the estate that they had. They had two fairly large properties, and they had to sell one entire property and part of the second one. And what's interesting, and I found this in a couple spots. One spot said that, they were forced to move out of their home. But other places said that for the last year or so before the second court proceeding actually kicked off, they were living a caravan-style arrangement. It's kind of like living in little trailers is what it sounded like. And so I don't really know if they actually lost a house or if they just lost a section of property because that's where they chose to live. But that's where they ended up. Charles Cardell, shortly after this, I mean, it was less than 10 years really, would pass away in 1977. And cause of death, I'm going to go with old age because he was born in 1895, mind you. There wasn't like a specific thing, like not a heart attack or flu or whatever. Mary would go on to live a few more years, and she would eventually pass away in 1984. So even though this, when you read through some of the articles and some of the stories that you can find online, this sounds like it was a long time ago, but it was only like 60 years ago. Most of this stuff is happening within the last 150 years. The modern day Wicca movement is fascinating in the fact that it grew as fast as it did with such a base level foundation. Other religions didn't spread quite that fast and get as large as this one did, the Wicca movement. And I'm not sure how to phrase this. I don't fully believe that what Gardner did was a very full compilation of an ancient one religion. I think he had a line that he worked with and then added more into it to fulfill what he was working towards. And that's fine. But what Charles did was a little bit different, and again, there may have been a lot of validity to what he was saying and what he was doing with his coven of Athor, became Athos, but the way he went about things wasn't exactly the best. You're trying to improve the look of something that had been demonized for so many years, and then you literally play into all of the stereotypes. Again, not a good look. And I will be honest here, I've heard about Charles, and I did hear about a lot of the wars, as I said earlier. I haven't read all of the books. I haven't read any of his books. I've read some of the quotes from them. I've read excerpts from them, but the full book itself, no. There are things that I've been wanting to pick up for a while, so I may just have to do that so I can update anything that needs to be updated here. And he had some very interesting ways of dealing with people, whether through lawsuits or sending them random boxes of broken fish and stabbed effigies. He seemed a bit litigious, but he also seemed very hungry for knowledge, and I honestly, from everything I was reading online about him, I think it was knowledge, but also for power. Like, he wanted to be a leader, but he didn't want to be public about it. And he seemed a bit litigious, but there's other places that reference a lot of these lawsuits that they brought, Charles and Mary, were ones that she actually instigated. So was it him being litigious, or was it her? I don't know exactly, but there was a lot of lawsuits going on. And from what I have seen and heard over the years, I feel in a lot of ways what Charles was doing was actually a very similar path to Gerald Gardner's. But thanks to Raymond, the coven actually was born and the new line was established. Charles wasn't a prolific writer. He wrote several articles, but he only wrote like 2 primary books, and they were both under fake names. His coven may or may not have been inspired by the way the Gardner's line of witchcraft was. Like I said, there's a lot of things that are different about it, but not drastically different. Is it the same as Gerald's? Absolutely not. I will say that, because you can read some of the rituals in some of the other books that I have read. They talk about the Coven of Atho versus Gerald Gardner's Gardenian line. There's similarities to the rituals, but they're by any means identical? No. So Charles, in a way, did help set up and establish a new line of Wicca, but another person would actually flesh it out and make it public and make it last, and that was Raymond. And more just out of curiosity, because he's not super well known outside of people who've studied this particular vein of Wicca and wanted to get into side characters. So if you ever heard of Charles and the Coven of Athor or Atho, like I said at the beginning, this is a introduction. This is not a full-blown biography. This is not meant to be a deep dive expose. This is more of like, so here's one of the guys that helped establish Wicca. And some of the myths and lore that surround him, because it is kind of interesting to see just how this gentleman came into his right and where he went with it, because it was all over the place. And if you're interested, you want to dig deeper, you want to whet your appetite, you can check out the links below. I put a note next to one helpful website, and it's thewicca.co.uk, and that is a link to a little bit more about the Coven of Atho specifically, but it does give some good information about Charles here. And the author of that website and that article wrote the book Here Be Magic, and there's a link to that as well. I was able to find, Amazon actually carries them, both of the books that Charles wrote. The one under the name Rex Nemorensis, which was called Witch, and then he did a second one under his other name, which was like Dr. Orja or something like that, called Witchcraft, but craft is with a K. So you can check those out if you're interested. I will be, like I said, going through those as soon as I get my next paycheck, because I have to limit myself on the books that I buy, because I have a problem there. I just like to read. But yeah, if you're interested, you can check those out down below. The one thing that was weird is you can find excerpts from his books, but they're not on Kindle that I could find, and I couldn't find another digital way of showing them. You can find like little blurbs and blips, but otherwise it's the paper versions, which I personally prefer, because you can put notes in the columns, you can put bookmarks in, paper clip spots that you want to remember to go back to. I'm big on having a physical book, especially when we're talking about metaphysics and the occult, so that you can, you know, have records of things a little bit better, and not, it kind of adds to the secrecy and the mythos of the occult and the mysteries that go along with it. With that, thank you guys for checking this out. As I said at the beginning, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button, drop a like on the video, comment to let me know your thoughts. And if you have any suggestions for other people, let me know, because I will be adding those to my list. I've got a pretty long list, but if there's certain people that I missed in the main line of Wicca in particular, or witchcraft in general, let me know. The one thing that I will say for now, I would rather not cover people who are still currently alive and practicing, unless I can do a video and possibly follow it up with an interview, and I'm just not quite there yet. So we're kind of looking at the history more so than the modern day is what my focus is. So with that, I'll let you guys go. Have a great rest of your week, and I will see you in the next video.